It was a dark and stormy night when Lisa Brooks, an FBI agent, finally finished her shift and began the long drive home. She had spent hours working on a case that had drained her mentally and physically, and all she wanted now was the comfort of her bed. As the rain tapped rhythmically against her windshield, she let out a deep sigh, feeling the weariness settle into her bones. The dim glow of her dashboard was the only light cutting through the pitch-black night as her car glided down the empty road. The town she was passing through was small, almost forgotten in the corners of the state, with narrow streets and older homes that stood as silent witnesses to the passing years. It wasn't the kind of place Lisa visited often. In fact, she only passed through here on rare occasions when work demanded it, or when her GPS directed her to take this route, which was the case tonight. She had never had a reason to stop, and now with the storm swirling around her, she had even more reason to keep going. As Lisa glanced in her rearview mirror, her stomach dropped. A set of headlights was approaching quickly from behind. The bright glare cut through the rain, catching her off guard. At first, she thought it might just be another late-night traveler, someone as eager as she was to get home. But as the vehicle closed in, Lisa's instincts began to tingle. The shape of the lights, the height of the car, it was a police cruiser. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel, and her heartbeat quickened, though she wasn't sure why just yet. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was driving within the speed limit, obeying every traffic law. There was no reason for a police officer to be following her, yet the car remained behind her, matching her pace. The rain began to come down harder, and a flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead. In that brief moment of light, she could see the cruiser's roof lights waiting as if the officer were contemplating whether to stop her or not. Lisa's mind raced. She had been through this before, being pulled over, questioned, her legitimacy challenged, all because of the color of her skin. And though she was an FBI agent, tonight, she was just another black woman driving through a town that might not be welcoming to someone like her. Her badge was tucked away in her bag, but would it even matter? Too often she had seen how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control, and she wasn't in the mood for a confrontation. The cruiser's lights flashed on, bathing the road in red and blue. Her heart sank. It was happening. She was being pulled over. She checked her mirrors, signaled, and slowly brought her car to the side of the road, pulling under the shadow of a large oak tree. The sound of the rain drumming on her roof filled the silence. She turned off the engine but kept her hands on the steering wheel, as she had been taught. This wasn't her first traffic stop, and she knew the rules. Always keep your hands visible, always be respectful, and never, ever make any sudden movements. She took a deep breath and waited. The door of the police cruiser creaked open, and through the rain-splattered window she saw a tall figure emerge. The officer moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. He approached her car, and through the downpour, Lisa could see the outline of his uniform, the badge glinting briefly in the dim light. His posture was rigid, his walk authoritative. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, not from fear of the officer himself, but from what she knew could come next. It wasn't just about being pulled over. It was about how these situations often escalated, about the assumptions people like this officer might make the moment they saw her. The officer reached her window and tapped on it with his flashlight. Lisa rolled it down just enough for their voices to carry over the sound of the storm, the cold air immediately hitting her face. She looked up at him, catching his name on the badge, Officer Brian Thompson. His face was set in a hard, unreadable expression, though his eyes carried a certain intensity that made Lisa uneasy. "License and registration," Thompson said, his voice as cold as the night. There was no politeness, no explanation for why she had been stopped, just a demand. Lisa, maintaining her composure, reached for her glove compartment, careful to keep her movements slow and deliberate. She retrieved her documents and handed them to him. He didn't say a word as he took them, but his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, scrutinizing her. Lisa knew that look. It was the same look she had encountered many times before, the look that questioned her very presence, that assumed she didn't belong. Thompson glanced over her license, then back at her. "What brings you to this part of town?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "I'm just passing through," Lisa replied, her voice calm. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions in check during these encounters. Losing her temper or showing any frustration would only give officers like Thompson more reason to escalate things. Thompson's gaze narrowed. "Is that right?" he said, almost as if he didn't believe her. He leaned in slightly, looking around the interior of her car, his flashlight illuminating every corner. "FBI, huh?" he added, spotting the small identification card tucked in her visor. "That's convenient." Lisa didn't respond. She knew where this was heading. The officer was already doubting her story, and she could sense his growing hostility. Thompson wasn't just questioning her because she was in a town she didn't frequent. He was questioning her because she was a black woman claiming to be an FBI agent. To him, that seemed impossible. The air between them grew thick with tension, and Lisa's thoughts began to race. She could easily show him her FBI badge and end this right now. It would confirm her identity, and Thompson would have no choice but to let her go. But she had seen too many situations where the badge didn't make a difference, where even law enforcement officers dismissed her because of the color of her skin. "You got something else to show me?" Thompson asked, his tone mocking now. He straightened up, crossing his arms as if waiting for her to make a mistake, to give him a reason to act. Lisa held his gaze but didn't reach for her badge, not yet. She could see the prejudice in his eyes, the assumptions he had already made about her. He wasn't treating this like a routine stop. This was personal for him. He was enjoying the power he held over her, relishing the fact that he could control the situation with just a few words. Lisa remained calm, though inside the frustration was building. She knew what was happening. Thompson was trying to provoke her, to push her into a corner where she would have no choice but to react. It was a game of power, and he was using every tool at his disposal to remind her of her place. But Lisa wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Not yet. Officer Thompson's patience seemed to wear thin. His eyes darted from her face to her car, scanning every inch as if searching for something, anything, that would give him an excuse to escalate the situation. Lisa could feel the weight of his suspicion pressing down on her, the moment hanging in the air like a blade ready to drop. The storm outside only made the atmosphere more tense, the rain hammering down on the roof of her car, drowning out everything but the sound of her own heartbeat. Thompson took a step back, then unexpectedly, he spoke again, his voice low and dripping with contempt. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his words carrying a dangerous edge that made Lisa's pulse quicken. She hesitated for a split second, her mind racing. Was this the moment to flash her badge, to let him know that he was treading on dangerous ground by pushing her any further? But she could see it in his eyes. The badge might not stop him. In fact, it might provoke him even more. The air between them crackled with tension. Lisa's training as an FBI agent kicked in, reminding her to stay calm, to remain in control of the situation no matter how hostile it became. She slowly unlocked her seatbelt and without a word opened the door. The cold night air hit her immediately, the wind whipping rain across her face as she stepped out onto the slick, wet road. Thompson stood there, towering over her, his flashlight still aimed at her face as if she were some kind of threat. He motioned her away from the car, his movements stiff and aggressive. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, and Lisa complied, raising her hands just enough to show that she was unarmed, that she wasn't a danger. But she knew in his eyes she had already been judged. "I'm just passing through," Lisa said again, her voice steady but firm, trying to diffuse the tension. But Thompson wasn't interested in explanations. He wasn't even interested in the truth. His eyes were locked on her, his mind set on proving his power, his authority over her. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, and Lisa could feel the shift in his demeanor. His suspicion had turned to something uglier, something fueled by the deeply ingrained prejudice that had been simmering just beneath the surface since the moment he saw her. "FBI, huh?" he repeated, his voice mocking. "You expect me to believe that?" Lisa held her ground, refusing to back down even as her nerves tightened. Thompson's flashlight moved lower, scanning the ground and then her car, as if searching for a reason to justify his aggression. The rain was falling harder now, making it difficult to see clearly, but Lisa kept her focus on Thompson, watching every movement, calculating her next step. Without warning, Thompson reached out and grabbed her arm, yanking her away from her car. The sudden force of the move made her stumble, and in that instant, she felt her FBI badge slip from her jacket pocket and fall to the ground, landing with a soft thud in the wet grass by the roadside. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thompson froze, his grip still firm on her arm, but his eyes were now locked on the shiny gold badge lying at his feet. The small emblem of the FBI gleamed under the rain, unmistakable in its authority, its power. Lisa didn't move, didn't say a word, as she watched the realization wash over him like a wave. The change in Thompson was immediate. His jaw clenched and his eyes widened in shock, the cold arrogance that had been so present just moments before evaporating as he stared at the badge. He released her arm, stepping back as if he had just touched something that burned him. The silence between them was thick, the rain the only sound breaking through the tension. Thompson swallowed hard, his entire demeanor shifting from one of power to one of disbelief. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the badge on the ground, unable to process what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to be how it went. In his mind, she was just another person he could intimidate, someone who didn't belong in his town, someone who wasn't supposed to fight back. But now, staring at the undeniable proof of her identity, he was forced to confront the reality that he had been wrong, terribly wrong. Lisa bent down slowly, picking up the badge, holding it in her hand as she met Thompson's eyes. The rain continued to pour down on both of them, but neither moved. She could see the disbelief in his face, the way his confidence had shattered in an instant. Thompson opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He was speechless, his mind racing to figure out how to salvage the situation he had created. But it was too late. Lisa didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power of the moment was already too great. "This badge," she said, holding it up for him to see, "doesn't just represent my authority. It represents the trust that people like you break every day when you assume that someone like me doesn't belong. When you use your badge to intimidate and control instead of protect and serve." Her words cut through the storm, hitting Thompson with the weight of the truth he had been avoiding. Lisa could see the guilt begin to settle in his eyes, the realization that he had let his prejudice cloud his judgment, that he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. "You thought you could treat me like this because of the color of my skin," Lisa continued, her voice unwavering. "You thought your badge gave you the right to disrespect me, to question my integrity, to harass me because you didn't think someone like me could possibly be in the position I'm in." Thompson's face flushed red, but he didn't respond. There was nothing he could say. The rain kept pouring, the storm matching the turmoil inside him as he stood there, his authority crumbling around him. He was no longer in control of the situation. Lisa stepped closer to him, her badge held tightly in her hand. "This isn't just about you and me," she said, her voice softer now, but still filled with purpose. "This is about every person who's been stopped, questioned, harassed, or worse, just because they didn't fit the image you thought they should. It's about the abuse of power, the way people like you hide behind your badge to justify your actions." Thompson shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words sinking in. He had never been forced to confront this truth before, had never been held accountable for the biases that had guided him for so long. But now, standing in front of Lisa, facing the consequences of his actions, he could no longer hide from it. Lisa took a deep breath, letting the moment linger before stepping back. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to him to grapple with it. She turned, walking back to her car, feeling the shift in the atmosphere as she opened the door. The power had changed hands and there was no going back. Thompson didn't move. He couldn't. He stood there in the rain, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him as Lisa started her car and drove away, leaving him alone with the reality he had been trying to avoid for so long. The storm raged on, but inside his mind, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would change him forever. He had no choice now but to face it. The following morning, Officer Brian Thompson sat at his kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of him. The events of the previous night played on a loop in his mind, each detail more vivid than the last. He couldn't escape the weight of what had happened, no matter how hard he tried to push it aside. The storm had passed, but inside his head, a different kind of storm was raging, and there was no end in sight. It was early, barely sunrise, but Thompson hadn't slept. After returning to the station the night before, he had been too rattled to settle down. He had tried to go through the motions, file his paperwork, and maintain some sense of normalcy, but nothing felt right. His encounter with Lisa Brooks had shaken him to his core. The image of her FBI badge, shining under the rain-soaked night, kept flashing before his eyes. Her words echoed in his ears, each one a sharp reminder of the line he had crossed. He had never been the kind of officer to think too much about his actions. He had spent years patrolling the same streets, pulling over the same kinds of people, doing what he thought was his job. But now, for the first time, he was being forced to confront the reality of what his badge had allowed him to do. And the realization that he had abused that power, repeatedly, was something he could no longer ignore. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. Thompson glanced at the screen, recognizing the number immediately. It was the chief's office. He let out a deep sigh, already knowing what this call was about. There was no avoiding it. He picked up the phone, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Thompson," he answered, trying to sound more composed than he felt. "Brian, we need you to come in," the voice on the other end said, flat and without any warmth. It was Captain Morris, a man who had been Thompson's superior for nearly a decade. His tone left no room for doubt. This wasn't a request. "We've got a situation." Thompson's heart sank. He knew what this was. Lisa Brooks wasn't just anyone. She was FBI. He had overstepped, and now he was going to face the consequences. He swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a stone in his chest. "I'll be there in 10, Thompson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He hung up and sat in silence for a moment longer, gathering himself before grabbing his keys and heading out the door. The drive to the station felt longer than usual, even though the roads were clear. His mind was racing, replaying every word, every moment from the night before. He had known as soon as he saw that badge that he had made a colossal mistake, but it wasn't just about Lisa Brooks. It was about everything that had led up to that moment. The years of unchecked authority, the way he had become numb to the people he was supposed to protect, the way he had let his biases shape his actions. He had always justified it as part of the job, but now, sitting behind the wheel, he realized how deeply wrong he had been. When he arrived at the station, the usual hum of activity seemed distant. Officers were going about their business, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. Thompson could feel the eyes on him as he walked through the doors. He wasn't sure if it was his own guilt making him feel paranoid, or if the rumors had already started spreading. But either way, it was clear. Something had changed. Captain Morris was waiting for him in his office, his face grim as Thompson stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, sealing him into the moment he had been dreading since he first saw the FBI badge hit the ground. "Take a seat," Morris said, not bothering with pleasantries. His tone was all business, the gravity of the situation apparent in every word. Thompson sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, trying to keep his nerves in check. He had faced plenty of disciplinary meetings over the years, but this felt different. This felt final. Morris sat across from him, a file in front of him on the desk. He opened it, flipping through a few pages before speaking. "Last night we received a formal complaint," he began, his eyes never leaving Thompson's. "Agent Lisa Brooks, FBI, has reported the incident from your traffic stop. I don't need to tell you how serious this is." Thompson swallowed hard, nodding. His mouth was dry, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he could even speak. "I know," he managed, his voice barely audible. Morris didn't soften. He had been through this too many times with officers who had made mistakes, but this one was different. The involvement of a federal agent meant the stakes were higher. "We've reviewed the dashcam footage," he continued, leaning back in his chair. "It's clear that you didn't follow protocol. Your actions were troubling." The word troubling hung in the air. but Thompson knew it was a generous understatement. His actions had been more than troubling. They had been reckless, dangerous, and rooted in assumptions he couldn't deny. Morris leaned forward, his expression serious. "Effective immediately. You're suspended from duty pending a full investigation." The words hit Thompson like a punch to the gut. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. Suspended. His badge, his authority, everything that had defined him for the last decade was being taken away, at least for now. He opened his mouth to respond, but there was nothing he could say. He had no defense. "I'm sorry," Thompson finally muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. Morris didn't respond immediately. He just studied Thompson for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether the apology was genuine or simply a reaction to the consequences he was facing. After a long pause, he spoke again, his tone more resigned. "You should have thought about that last night." Thompson nodded, his eyes downcast. The truth was, he hadn't thought. Not really. He had let his instincts, his biases take over. He had acted without consideration for the person standing in front of him, a person who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space he had unconsciously claimed as his own. Morris closed the file and stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You'll receive a formal notice of the suspension," he said. "In the meantime, you're to turn in your badge and gun." The request, though expected, felt like a final blow. Thompson stood slowly, reaching for the badge that had been clipped to his belt for years. It felt heavier than ever as he unclipped it and set it on the desk. Then came the gun, the tools of his authority, the symbols of his power, both laid out in front of him, now out of his reach. As Thompson walked out of the office, the weight of his actions settled fully on his shoulders. He had always seen himself as a protector, someone who upheld the law, but last night had stripped away that illusion. He had been an enforcer of something far more insidious: prejudice, bias, and unchecked power. Outside, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Thompson stood there for a moment, staring at the sky, unsure of what to do next. His suspension was only the beginning. The investigation would dig into his past, his record, his every action. And it wasn't just about this one incident. It was about the pattern of behavior that had led him to that moment with Lisa Brooks. His reputation, once solid and respected in the department, was now in ruins. The whispers would spread, the judgment from his peers already beginning. He wasn't sure how to face them, or if he even wanted to. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. For the first time in years, Officer Brian Thompson felt powerless, and for the first time, he understood what it was like to stand on the other side of that power. Lisa Brooks sat at her desk the morning after the incident, surrounded by the familiar hum of the FBI office. The steady rhythm of her colleagues typing, phones ringing, and conversations flowing around her provided a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. Despite the noise, her mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous night, the confrontation with Officer Thompson playing in her head on a continuous loop. She had been in situations like this before: racial profiling, being stopped or questioned because of the color of her skin rather than anything she had done. But this time, it had cut deeper. This time, she hadn't just been an ordinary citizen trying to go about her business. She had been an FBI agent, someone who was supposed to represent justice, fairness, and equality. Yet none of that had mattered to Officer Thompson when he looked at her. All he had seen was a black woman who didn't belong in his world, and he had acted accordingly. Lisa had spent years navigating the delicate balance between being a black woman and being a federal agent, knowing that for some people, the badge she carried would never erase the prejudice they held. She had hoped that things were changing, that the world was moving forward, but incidents like last night were a harsh reminder that there was still so much work to be done. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen to see a message from her supervisor, Special Agent Carter. "Can you come to my office? Need to talk." Lisa felt a pang of unease as she read the message, though she wasn't surprised. After filing her complaint, she knew this meeting was inevitable. She stood, straightened her jacket, and made her way to Carter's office, her mind still swirling with a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, exhaustion. She knew what needed to be done, but that didn't make it any easier. When she arrived at the office, Carter was seated behind his desk, his expression neutral but serious. He motioned for her to sit, and she did so, folding her hands in her lap as she prepared for the conversation. "I read your report," Carter began, his voice measured. "I've also spoken with the local department. Officer Thompson has been suspended pending investigation." Lisa nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that. On one hand, Thompson's suspension was a necessary step toward accountability. But on the other hand, it didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the fact that Thompson had viewed her, not as a fellow law enforcement officer, but as a threat, simply because of her race. "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Thompson," Carter continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But this time it's different. You're FBI, and that puts a spotlight on the entire situation." Lisa met his gaze, understanding what he wasn't saying out loud. Her badge had afforded her a level of protection that most people in her situation didn't have. If she hadn't been an FBI agent, if she had been just another black woman driving through a small town, would Thompson have faced any consequences at all? The thought made her stomach turn. "I know," Lisa said quietly, "but this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Thompson to continue acting on their biases without being held accountable. It's about the countless people who've been in my shoes but didn't have the power or the platform to speak out." Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. He respected Lisa, not just for her skills as an agent, but for her integrity and dedication to justice. He had seen her rise through the ranks despite the challenges she faced, and he knew how much this situation weighed on her. "What do you want to do?" Carter asked after a moment of silence. Lisa paused, considering the question. She had spent years fighting for justice within the system, but there were times when it felt like the system itself was the problem. She wanted to hold Thompson accountable, yes, but more than that, she wanted to spark change. Real, lasting change that would prevent officers like him from wielding their power unchecked. "I want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug," Lisa said firmly. "Thompson needs to face the consequences of his actions, but we also need to address the larger issue. This isn't just about one bad cop, it's about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchallenged." Carter nodded, clearly considering her words. "There's going to be a lot of attention on this case," he said, "especially with the FBI involved. If you're willing, we can make sure it becomes part of a broader conversation about police reform." Lisa appreciated his support, but she also knew how hard it would be to turn this moment into meaningful change. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and the forces resisting reform were deeply entrenched. Still, she was ready for the fight. She had no choice but to be. "I'm willing," Lisa replied, her voice resolute. "But I'm not just looking for a conversation. I want action. I want to see real consequences for officers who abuse their power. I want to see training programs that actually work, and I want to see a shift in the way law enforcement views the people they're supposed to protect." Carter gave her a small, approving nod. "It's going to be a long road," he said, "but you've got my support. We'll take this as far as we can." Lisa felt a weight lift from her shoulders, if only slightly. She knew the fight ahead would be difficult, but having allies like Carter made it seem a little less daunting. She rose from her chair, feeling a sense of purpose settle over her. "Thank you," she said. "I won't let this go." As she left Carter's office, Lisa felt the resolve in her chest harden. She was no stranger to obstacles, no stranger to the fight for justice, but this time felt different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been pulled over, questioned, or harassed because of the color of their skin. She was fighting for those who didn't have a badge to protect them, who didn't have the privilege of filing a formal complaint and knowing it would be taken seriously. Later that day, as she sat at her desk reviewing case files, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a colleague she hadn't spoken to in a while. "Saw what happened. Glad you're speaking out. Let me know if you need anything." The message was simple, but it reminded Lisa that she wasn't alone in this fight. There were others, inside and outside of law enforcement, who were ready for change, who were tired of the status quo. The media had already picked up on the story, and Lisa knew that in the coming days, her name and Thompson's would be at the center of a national conversation. There would be debates, opinions, and arguments from every side. Some would try to paint Thompson as a victim of circumstance, while others would use the incident to push for sweeping reforms. But Lisa was ready for it all. She had spent her entire life navigating systems that weren't built for people like her, and she had learned how to survive, how to fight back, how to push for change in ways that mattered. That evening, as the sun set over the city and the office emptied out, Lisa sat alone at her desk, staring at the skyline through the window. She knew that this fight wouldn't end with Thompson's suspension, or even with his potential dismissal from the force. The problem was bigger than one man, bigger than one police department. It was a system-wide issue, a cultural problem that required systemic solutions. But Lisa also knew that change didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, through small victories and incremental progress. And as much as the events of the previous night had shaken her, they had also reignited a fire in her. A fire that had been burning for years but had been dimmed by the weight of constantly battling the same issues over and over. Now that fire was blazing again, and Lisa was determined to use it to fuel the change she wanted to see. It wasn't just about holding Officer Thompson accountable. It was about holding the entire system accountable, and she wouldn't stop until real reform was achieved. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Officer Thompson's actions rippled far beyond the small town where it all began. The story of the traffic stop and the subsequent confrontation with FBI agent Lisa Brooks had captured national attention. News outlets ran segments about it, framing it as yet another incident of police overreach and systemic racism. Social media was ablaze with discussions, and hashtags like "Schwar Justice for Lisa" and "Hosh Reform the System" trended for days. But beneath the noise, Lisa remained focused on the bigger picture. Her inbox had been flooded with messages from people all over the country, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of encounters with law enforcement that had left them feeling powerless and discriminated against. As she read through the emails, she felt the weight of what had happened settle even more heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her and Officer Thompson. It was about something far deeper, something that had been festering in the fabric of American society for generations. One message in particular stuck with her. It was from a young woman named Tara, who wrote about a similar experience she had had 2 years earlier in a neighboring state. Tara had been pulled over by an officer for what he claimed was a broken taillight, but from the moment she rolled down her window, the interaction had taken a dark turn. The officer had questioned her aggressively, made assumptions about where she was coming from and where she was going, and by the end of the encounter, she had been left shaken and humiliated. She hadn't had the power or the resources to fight back then, and Tara's email made it clear that she hadn't forgotten the way she had been treated. Reading Tara's words, Lisa was reminded of all the stories that had come before hers, stories of black men and women, young and old, stopped for no reason other than the fact that they looked like they didn't belong. She wasn't the first person to go through this, and she knew she wouldn't be the last. But what struck her was the common thread running through all of the stories she read. People felt powerless. They felt like the system was rigged against them, like no matter what they did, they would always be seen as a threat first and a human being second. Lisa spent her days working her regular cases at the FBI, but her nights were filled with planning. She was determined to use the momentum of the moment to push for something greater. She had already met with several advocacy groups and civil rights organizations who were eager to work with her, not just because of her position in law enforcement, but because of her experience as a black woman navigating a system that was often hostile to people like her. Together, they began drafting proposals for new training programs, policies aimed at curbing racial profiling, and reforms that would hold officers like Thompson accountable for their actions. But Lisa knew that real change would require more than policy. It would require a cultural shift, a rethinking of what policing meant in communities like hers. She wasn't naive. She understood that the fight for reform was going to be long and hard, that there would be resistance from people who saw any attempt at changing the status quo as an attack on law enforcement itself. But Lisa had spent her entire career fighting uphill battles, and she wasn't about to back down now. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson's world was unraveling. His suspension had been extended indefinitely, and an internal investigation was underway. The local police department, which had initially tried to keep the situation quiet, found itself at the center of a growing public relations crisis. There were protests in front of the station, with activists calling for his immediate termination and for a broader reckoning with the department's handling of racial profiling cases. Thompson himself had become a pariah, not just in the community but within his own department. The other officers, once his close colleagues, now avoided him, their conversations falling silent whenever he walked into a room. He had been the subject of whispered gossip before, but now those whispers had turned into open disdain. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, someone who operated with impunity under the badge, but now he was faced with the stark reality of his actions. His suspension was no longer just about the incident with Lisa. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of complaints against him. Cases where he had been accused of using excessive force, where he had pulled over black and brown drivers for minor infractions that should have never escalated. It was clear that this wasn't a one-time mistake. Thompson had allowed his biases to guide him for years, and now he was paying the price. One night, sitting alone in his apartment, Thompson stared at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was a far cry from the confident, self-assured officer he had once been. His reputation was in tatters, his career likely over. And for the first time, he began to question everything he had ever believed about himself, about his role as a police officer, and about the power he had wielded over others. Lisa, meanwhile, was preparing for the next phase of her campaign. She had been invited to speak at a town hall meeting, organized by a coalition of civil rights groups and community leaders who were eager to address the issue of police reform head-on. The town hall was being held in a large community center, and the turnout was bigger than anyone had expected. Rows of chairs were filled with people from all walks of life: activists, residents, students, and even a few members of the local police department, though they kept to the back of the room, observing quietly. As Lisa stood on the stage looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a sense of responsibility wash over her. She had always been comfortable speaking in public, but this was different. This wasn't just about delivering a speech, it was about igniting a movement. The air in the room was charged with anticipation as the crowd waited for her to begin. When she spoke, her voice was calm but resolute. She shared her story, not just of the night with Officer Thompson, but of her entire journey as a black woman in law enforcement. She spoke about the challenges she had faced, the moments of doubt, and the weight of carrying both her badge and her identity in a world that often saw them as incompatible. But most importantly, she spoke about the need for change. "We can't just focus on one bad cop," Lisa said, her voice carrying across the room. "This is about the system that allows bad cops to thrive. It's about the culture that teaches officers to see black and brown people as threats first and citizens second. We need to change that culture. We need to hold officers accountable, not just when they get caught, but before they have the chance to harm the people they're supposed to protect." The crowd responded with nods of agreement, murmurs of support rippling through the room. Lisa continued, outlining her vision for reform: mandatory bias training, stronger oversight, and community-based policing that would prioritize trust and relationships over intimidation and control. But she was also clear about the challenges ahead. "I know this isn't going to be easy," she said, looking directly at the faces in the audience. "There are going to be people who resist. There are going to be people who say we're attacking law enforcement, who will try to shut this movement down before it even starts. But we can't let that stop us. Change doesn't come without a fight, and this fight is worth it." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. People stood, clapping and cheering, not just for Lisa, but for the hope she represented. She had given voice to something that many in the room had been feeling for a long time, but hadn't been able to articulate. As the applause died down, Lisa stepped off the stage, greeted by handshakes, hugs, and words of encouragement from those who had gathered. But she knew that the real work was just beginning. This town hall was a start, but it was only one step on a long road toward justice and reform. There would be more meetings, more protests, more conversations. There would be setbacks and moments of frustration, but Lisa was ready for it. She had spent her entire life preparing for this fight, and now that it had begun, she wasn't going to stop. Later that night, as she sat at home reflecting on the day, she opened her laptop and typed out a message to Tara, the young woman who had shared her story. "Thank you for your email," Lisa wrote. "I know how hard it is to share what you went through, but your story, and others like it, are exactly why I'm doing this. We deserve better. We all do. And I'm going to keep fighting until we get it." She hit send, feeling a sense of resolve settle over her. The fight for justice was far from over, but now, more than ever, she knew she wasn't fighting alone.